in the feeling of the room. Of course, people are grieving. They feel the loss. The corpse no longer communicates. I don't mean to make light of this. But there is a serious sense in that room that, number one, the spirit of the person is with us. And number two, because the person doesn't have to speak out to make decisions during his lifetime, or hers, the fact that he or she doesn't speak out to make decisions about the disposal of the corpse or the arrangements of the funerals doesn't mean that in some way he or she is treated any differently just because her eyes are now closed. Asked at a conference of medical ethicists in Japan, well, when does the person die? When is it really gone? When is he or she no longer with us? The answer was, when they're cremated, when they no longer have a face. Now, how can we ever get organ donations out of that kind of situation? And the answer is with extreme difficulty. It's already possible to get eye banks, kidney banks in Japan, because as you know, you can take corneas and kidneys out of people who are still, who are long dead. The eyes take several days to disintegrate, as do the kidneys, and they're still functioning. But other organs like heart, lungs, liver, and so on, have to be taken out of a heart-beating patient. This is the whole brain death issue, and I'm introducing you to Japan's stand on the brain death issue. The answer is, we may not be able to detect with our instruments when somebody's present or not in their body. Now, the Western line then goes, if there is no chance of them contributing to our society or interacting with our society, then their utility as a human is done. They're not a person anymore, is the kind of language that's used. But in Japan, we have the notion of interdependence, and this includes the notion that we reciprocate. And I value my elders not because they're going to do something more for me, but because they have done so much for me already. Even if they are comatose, or unable to respond, or not coherent, that doesn't change their value. And their value is not because they will do something, but because they have done so much. That's the Japanese attitude. And the Japanese would point out a few things about Western transplantation. Number one, it's all a numbers game. You know, only about 5,000 transplantations have happened ever. And they all happen from people who are on respirators, because the issue doesn't come up unless somebody's on a respirator, keeping them artificially alive. And the statistics are something like this. If somebody has flat brain waves for 10 seconds, their chances of coming back are about 1 in 10. If they have flat brain waves for a couple of minutes, their chances of coming back are about 1 in 100. If they have flat brain waves for 6 hours, their chances of coming back are about 1 in 1,000. Now, those are pretty good odds if it's a cough syrup. You might even persuade me to take it. Those are the only side effects. But we're talking about 1 out of 1,000 people being potentially executed while not guilty. If only 999 of those people are definitely going, and 1 is possibly coming back. And when you start taking organs out of the beating body, he's definitely not coming back. I've come across a Japanese family whose father wanted his corneas donated after he passed, and they were duly contributed to the eye bank with his children's consent. And a few weeks later, everybody in the family started seeing ghosts of their eyeless father. Now, I don't know if the ghosts are out there or not. The fact that many people saw them suggests maybe they're more than the figment of one imagination. But whichever way you make it, if that's the psychological worldview, the mind frame in which people are living, simply changing a law to say, okay, it's now okay to cut open bodies, is not going to make that a viable procedure for this culture which so honors the elders who have cared for us. Let's go to our third issue. And that is one of compromise and conflict avoidance, where America has placed great stress on the importance of competition producing the best product. Japan, for at least 1,000 years, has felt that compromise, negotiation, and avoiding conflict is the way to go. Maybe if we were as crowded as Japan is, we'd come to that conclusion too. This has tragic consequences in trade negotiations. Sometimes I have, in earlier years, been translator to various trade delegations. And what inevitably happens is, the Americans are aiming for, let's imagine, they've got a product to sell and they want to sell it at $8 a gross. And the Japanese really can't afford to pay $8 a gross, or think they could get it for less than that from Southeast Asia, but then there's where the negotiations begin. The Americans start at 10, the Japanese start at 6. Reason would tell you that 8 might be a good compromise. But in the beginning, from the beginning, the Japanese, to show goodwill and to avoid conflict, say, well, we originally thought of 6, but we'll move to 7. Now, in a Japanese society, any such gesture would mean you compromise in the other direction. But in many American trade delegations, the solution is, good, they're coming our way, Joe, let's dig in our heels. 10's the only thing we'll take. It's like we make a concession and you slap us in the face, is the feeling we get in Japan. We've opened our markets, I'm speaking as a Japanese now, we've opened our markets on beef and oranges and cars and film and computers and almost all across the board. There's hardly a trade, a quota or a tax left in Japan. Every tax, and rice, of course, is basic to our economy. Every tax the Americans have said, open or else. The Japanese have opened up. And it hasn't done what the Americans expected to balance the American budget. The Japanese bought Australian beef and Argentine beef instead of American beef, because it's better and cheaper. We bought Italian and South African oranges instead of Florida oranges, because they're better and cheaper. We buy Agfa film instead of Kodak, because it's better and cheaper. We buy German cars instead of American cars, because they're more suited to our roads and our gasoline and so on. We buy Southeast Asian rice instead of American rice. Every new scheme that the American government has to balance payments, because we're going to sell Japan something that doesn't yet buy from us, hasn't done the market research to find out whether it's really the product the Japanese want in the first place. And every time the Japanese open their markets, their feeling is, more or less consciously, we've made this concession and this concession and this concession and this concession. Someday, maybe the Americans will make a few concessions. But the American approach is, no, for every concession, digging our heels. We're making progress, Joe. And this has led to a lot of ill feeling on both sides of the Pacific. And I don't mean to say that one side is right or wrong. Don't get me wrong on this. Americans have a lot to complain about in the Japanese market, as do the Japanese about the American treatment of their market. What I'm trying to expose to you tonight is the difference between when A makes a compromise on one piece of equipment or a sale or whatever, then the next time it's B's turn to make a compromise. Typically in a Japanese company, mid-level or small companies will be subcontracted by a large Toyota or some such large corporation. And even when Toyota doesn't need parts from a small company, Toyota will place trickle orders to keep that company alive. So the company doesn't have to lay off people. And then when Toyota suddenly develops a new model or gets an order for 10,000 units from Vietnam that's opened up, they say, we need 10,000 of these parts in 2 weeks. And the small company bends over backwards and works overtime without extra pay and everything else to supply those needs. It's give and take in a good sense. It's I'll stroke your back and you remember mine. It's we'll compromise about this to keep you going if you can compromise later to keep us going. If you put it badly, it's a whole bunch of ingrown networks. To put it well, those networks function marvelously. Except, sometimes in a medical situation, they cause problems. For starters, Japanese doctors, this is true in America too, but mostly in Japan, especially in Japan, Japanese doctors are pessimistic about their diagnoses, because if they were optimistic and the patients didn't live as long as they were expected to, this would cause a great disappointment and a loss of face on both sides. Whereas if the doctor is conservative, he thinks probably a 6 months, but if I tell him 3, I'm safe, then everyone's happy when the patient lives for 6 months or a year. The not so happy side of it is, in the only heart transplant case that has happened in Japan in 1967, Dr. Wada in Sapporo Medical School did a heart transplant, which of course was illegal because we didn't have brain death yet. That meant that he was taking one beating heart out of one person and replacing another beating heart of another person with that beating heart, killing 2 people. And because the second one also died, they were both manslaughter cases. He was indicted, and when he was arraigned to hearing, nobody could be found to testify against him. And police went and checked out the records in the hospital on that day. There weren't even records for what happened in the surgery room on that day. And the nurses and doctors who attended the operation had sudden amnesia, or were suddenly on vacation in Bali for an indefinite time. Now, that's because whistleblowing can't happen in this kind of network. That's the downside. And any nurse or paramedic who blew the whistle on Wada and said, yes, he did this operation, that caused 2 people to die, and he should be put away to jail, that medic or nurse or whomever would find themselves put away from the JMA and without a job at any hospital in Japan because the network is very tight. Now, this is all about medicine, but many of you are interested in Buddhism, so I want to move to how religion affects the Japanese view of death. Some 75% of Japanese claim to be Buddhist, and another 75 roughly claim to be Shinto, which means obviously that many are both. It's not surprising. And they're not terribly concerned about doctrine or doctrinal commitments. But they do place a premium on the moment of death and the style of death. And recently, in Kyoto University, I've been taking some surveys of what Japanese think is important about their dying environment. And this may be more Shinto than Buddhist, but they're extremely concerned that they die in the proper frame of mind. From early Shinto times, Shinto people were concerned to be buried in places with a good view, or under a cherry tree, or close to a river that was important to their childhood, as if they were going to continue to experience that nature. And the extension of that is, that's the kind of environment they would like to spend their last time in. Buddhism reinforced the concern with the nature of consciousness at the moment of death. There's lots of suicide in Buddhism. And suicide itself is never condemned. What's condemned is suicide out of selfish motive, out of anger or fear or resentment or frustration or trying to escape something. All of that is wrongly motivated suicide. A feeling of everything is finished. I've done everything I'm supposed to do in this birth, and I'm ready to move on to a different level of consciousness is an acceptable reason for moving on. If we think a little further about when samurai were allowed to suicide, There are two conditions under which a samurai was usually allowed to suicide. One is, if he's surrounded by enemies on a battlefield, no way he can fight his way out of this hedge of spears and arrows, but he's a high-ranking officer in some army. He can usually say, time out. It's not as funny as all that. I surrender, but give me time to make my own peace. And people respecting his rank would generally surround him with their spears, but give him time and space in which he could take off some of his armor, kneel down and make peace in himself, and decide his own consciousness at his moment of passing. The other time when it's acceptable for a samurai to suicide is if he's done something, and it was always a he in those days, I'm not being sexist, that was so terrible that it cut off relationship between him and the rest of the community. The average Taro on the street would get banished to the boondocks like Shinran or Honen did. But a samurai would be allowed to leave more honorably. If there's no possibility of continuing a meaningful relationship because I am so shamed or ostracized by something I have done, you know, that's an awful lot like the situations we now find in terminal patients. Situation one is, the terminal patient is so surrounded by some disease, whether it's cancer or a heart condition or a degenerative Alzheimer's or whatever, that there is no chance of escape. In that situation, the Japanese samurai could say, time out. I don't want to go down in a bloody, frustrating struggle with all you fuckers. I'm going to choose my time where I can go with composure. And this is it. The other possibility is the vegetative state, the brain death, the non-communicated locked-in syndrome, etc., in which Western doctors typically say, well, there's no more use in us communicating, no possibility of us communicating with him, so he's not useful to us, so we can pull the plug. And there are court cases about that, of course. In the Japanese viewpoint, if one is in that situation or in danger of ending up in that situation, rather than waiting till one is shipped off to the uninhabited island, in other words, vegetative, unable to communicate, one can decide in advance, this is my time, I will go as a gentleman. And the moment of death is seen as it's a wrapping up, it's like wrapping a present. It's like tying a bow on a painting you've finished. So that this is the last touch. And the last words are very important. The last thoughts are considered very important in what kind of rebirth one will have. And the environment is very important. Let's look at that. These overheads are in Japanese, so you'll have to forgive my translation. I did not have time to zap them out in English. But I asked a wide range of people, maybe I should give some background, lights can stay down. In what kind of environment, what's important to you to be around you as you go, in your last days? What do you want around you? It's an open-ended question only. And the vast majority, 40-some%, said, I want to be at home. Which is natural enough, but it doesn't happen in Japan much anymore. More than 80% of Japanese are now dying in hospitals as Americans. 38% say we want families around us. And after that, I get responses like, I want to be on my own tatami or in my own futon. I want to be in a quiet place surrounded by nature. I want to see trees. And a few rare people say, I want to be traveling somewhere and have hit me suddenly. These are the kind of open-ended responses we get. Why is this an important set of information? Well, there are a number of reasons. But one is, this can economically justify hospice work. In America, many of you know, hospices have been having tremendous economic trouble surviving. And they used to use these quality of life QOL surveys to try to prove that you were happier in an old folks home or a hospice than you were in your hospital or in your own home. And All the data seems to show you can't prove that. Because people who choose to go into hospitals are pretty happy in the hospitals they've chosen. The people who've chosen to stay home are happy staying home, and the people in the hospice are reasonably happy there. But if hospices couldn't justify themselves economically that way, how could they do it? And Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, the med school came up with the quality of death scale, in which they asked people, how do you want to spend the last, they said week, could be 3 days, could be a month of your life. What's important to you to have around you? What do you want that to be like? And then, after the person passed on, they asked the primary caregiver, who could be a wife or a nurse or somebody, what was their last week or month like? And you compare those answers and you find out that on a quality of death scale, of what you want the last week or month to be like, hospices are much, much better than hospitals. And you can economically vindicate them. Well, let's get more specific. You ask the Japanese, what do you want to see in your last week or month of life? Open-ended question, we give no hints, whatever comes to mind. The majority of them say, forests and trees, blue sky, mountains. The face of people only comes forth at 8% after those others. And then again, the horizon, rivers, snow, etc. Okay, so much for seeing. Let's go to, what do you want to hear in your last month, if you've got a choice about it? The largest group says, the singing of birds or frogs or insects, natural sounds that come from the fields and forests. Not a tape of them, please. I want to hear the real sound. Or the sound of wind and rain in the trees. Or, only third in the list, a bit lower, comes my favorite music. And then beyond that, the sound of rivers or rushing water, waves. And then fifthly, the sound of people's voices. So that nature sounds turn out to be very important to the Japanese. Maybe he was right. There may be more Japanese in Hawaii than he realized. This is quite different, however, from what Tennessee people tell us. What do you want to smell in your last month? The largest figure comes out to be flowers and grass. Trees, forests, blue sky. I'm not sure the blue sky has a smell, but fresh air. The rich earth, the smell of rain on the earth, perhaps. Some people say the salt wind from the sea. And then we get the tatami and the futon and things we eat. Well, speaking of eating, what do you want to eat in your last days, whenever that may be? And we get a wide assortment. There's not as much anonymity here. Most people say fruit, followed by water. It's usually oishimizu, I want to have clear, healthy, delicious water, and tea and Western food, Eastern food, and there's a smattering here. Well, what does all this tell us? We're asking questions in terms of, oh, one more. What do you want to touch in your last week or month? The vast majority is hold someone's hand. And way beyond, below that, is my own blanket, my own futon. And beyond that, a book, or a pet, or tatami. Now, we phrase this, let's see. We phrase this in terms of what do you want to do in your last week or month, but what this really tells us is what the Japanese value. If you ask yourself, where do I want to spend my last month? It doesn't have to be your last month. It's what do you want surrounding you? A picture will slowly or rapidly come to you of what's important in your environment. To see, to hear, to smell, to hold. And this quality of death measure, which is being used now in projects I'm involved with in setting up hospices and care facilities with prefectural governments in Japan, so we can build them homes where they can see these things and touch these things and smell these things, is also a marvelous indicator of what the Japanese want around them in their lives. And that's not purely Shinto, that would be too simple, but that's deeply in there. Now the other way in which religion affects people's lives is Japanese tell you they're not religious. But when push comes to shove and they're on their last days, most of them are deeply religious. I counsel an old gentleman who was chairman of a board of a big factory again for many years. He tells me over and over, there's nothing after death. And at the same time, there's tremendous fear in his facing this transition. And I'm supposed to be the counselor to help him deal with this. It's corny, I know. There ought to be more Japanese counselors, but there are maybe 3 in the country. So I leave him a sheet of paper and some colored pencils, and I ask him, you know, you are much closer to this experience than I am. You know more about the death experience and how it feels than I do, but I'm trying to study it. Please teach me. If you get any feelings, any intuitions, any sense of what it's like in the next week or 2 before our next appointment, make a sketch of it for me. Or write it down, whatever, but if you can sketch it, sketch it. He says, that's a silly request. I don't believe in it anyway. Besides, there's nothing to sketch. Well, I said, you can color the whole paper black. That makes, if that's your image. 2 weeks later, these pages are rich with imagery. If I get permission from the family, I may publish them some days. But there's something like a tamashi, a ball rising out of the head above a bed, looking down at the scene. And then there's a tunnel going into a realm of light. And then there's him talking to his teachers and his ancestors who are waiting for him in the next world. And this is nothing new. We have published accounts of near-death experiences in Japan from the 10th century. Which is one of the reasons I said in Japan. And I'm going to show you one I collected a couple years ago. Near-death experiences continue to happen in Japan and have a big impact on the Japanese view of this world and the next. I'll ask Arthur to hit the lights again. It's November of 1989, a rainy, sleety night in Tsukuba, which is north of Tokyo. A 16-year-old schoolboy gets off the school bus, starts across the unlit highway, and a car doing about 80 clicks over 50 miles an hour hits him, throws him about 50 feet. He hits his head on pavement. His brain is literally knocked half out of the brain case. He is picked up as terminal. He is rushed around to 3 hospitals, which all say, he's gone, we can't touch him, take him to the morgue. At the 4th hospital, all the bigwigs are in conference. So, and the only guy at the ICU, the intensive care unit that's at the emergency gate, is a 30-year-old doctor named Ayusawa, and he says, we'll take him. And boy, then does the trouble start. Because how do you resuscitate somebody who's just about gone? Well, his name is Nobori Takuro. He was gone for 49 days. And when he came back, which is the same day the emperor died, he couldn't use his mouth yet because he had a resuscitator, but he beckoned for pencil and paper and began writing in shaky hand his experience, which is so dramatic that the family contacted a professor, and the professor contacted me, and I got in on this, and we've made a book and a film about it. But his experience was a very typical near-death experience. And to document it, we hired artists to do montage, is that what the word in English? Montage documentation. You know, when there's a crime and you ask the witnesses of the crime, what did the criminal look like? And they say, well, he had kind of a round face and receding hairline, and get the artist to sketch that. And no, it was a little longer in the chin, and the eyebrows were bushier. So you erase the eyebrows and the chin, you make the bushier eyebrows and longer chin. And you keep erasing and rewriting and erasing and rewriting until the person says, that's him. Well, that's the technique. And we had these sketches done over and over again, and then colored over and over until we got them so nobody said, that's what it felt like. The first thing he felt was he was wearing his purple maroon school jersey with necktie and school outfit. He was lifted up above his battered body on the roadside and drifted up and up and up into a dark world. And in that dark world, he saw images of his past life flash before him, from his being coddled by his grandmother in swaddling clothes. No, he was in swaddling clothes. Get my English mixed up. To his not wanting to go to kindergarten, to his playing with ducks in Canada. His one trip abroad made a big impression on him. To his receiving his graduation papers from elementary school. These kinds of images passed before him. And he said what he got from all this was a deep sense of dependence. That his life had been so dependent on everybody else, and he was filled with gratitude and affection for all these people who had cared for him and nurtured him and given him these experiences. And then as these visions vanished from him, he felt very dark and cold and saw a light at the end of the tunnel. This is nothing new to you Americans. You've been reading about this since Kubler-Ross published stuff 20 years ago, perhaps. But desiring to move towards the end of the tunnel, he encountered a river. Now, the river is usually the boundary symbol for Japanese. It runs horizontally, and if you cross it, you don't come back to this world. It's the river Styx, Sans no Kawa. But for nobody, it ran vertically out of this darkness into the light. And as he approached the light, he came across an old boatman in a coracle, a round boat, Japanese-style boat. The boatman had a white kimono on with a migimai, the right lapel of his kimono was in front of. The one picture that no matter how many times we drew, nobody just wouldn't be satisfied with. He said, you can't capture the radiance of the flowery fields. It was like the light was pouring out of the flowers themselves at me. It was so glorious. And there was this line of trees going up to the horizon, and I started going up toward the horizon because it seemed like that was where the road was supposed to take me. And as I was going further, this old man met me and said, are you Kisaku? Now, Kisaku is his father's name. Nobody silently shook his head. No, I'm not Kisaku. Then the old man said, you can't be Takuro. You're too young to be here if you're Takuro. Takuro bowed and said, I'm Takuro. And the old man said, get out of here. You don't belong here. This is the place for you. Go home. But Takuro had just come from this very dark, cold place he didn't want to go back to. And being 15, 16 years old, he started a hide-and-seek game. He would hide behind the tree to get away from the old man. And the old man would come out and gesticulate and tell him another language, get out of here, go home. Takuro would dive into a bed of flowers and try to escape. The old man would follow him slowly and fetch him out and say, go home. Finally, he went back to the dark place. There was a story about this old man. When Takuro told his mother, or wrote this story to his parents when he came back, the dialect, the speech habits, the gestures, the height, the description of this old man matched completely not Takuro's granddad, but his mother's granddad, whom he'd never met. So the mother got sort of blue in the face and worried and agitated, went home and fetched some pictures of the great-granddad, whom Takuro had almost never seen while alive, and showed Takuro the pictures and said, is this the face you saw? And Takuro said, yeah, but when I met him, he wasn't wearing glasses. Get it? And what's more interesting is, if this is a self-generated dream, usually self-generated dreams don't propose wrong hypotheses before they come up with the right hypothesis. For the other person to say, are you your dad? And Takuro will say, that's a strange question, no, I'm not. And then finally to come up with the conclusion, you're not your dad, you're yourself. That's also very unusual for a standard dream. So even if this is a dream, it's a very interesting one. But next time, Takuro heads up the same river in this kind of a ship. Don't ask me why. The river got deeper all of a sudden. But he always was interested in sailing ships, and this is the kind that picked him up. And on the ship were all kinds of people who were in the process of changing out of their school clothes or other clothes into white kimonos, the death clothes. And he again landed in the flowery fields. flowery fields, up the trail to the horizon, and when he got to the horizon, this time, there was a forest of candles, and he had the feeling that each candle was a person's life, and he knew which candle was his, and it was flickering on the verge of extinction. It was about to go out. And this is a very common image in Japanese Shinto as well as Buddhism. This is a picture I took in a Shinto shrine where candles are dedicated to the memories of departed people, departed ancestors. We don't think of that as being terribly Shinto, but that's what's done here. And he had not seen this, but he was then found himself among the people who were represented by the dying candles. And they were lining up in front of two great gates, a great dark gate and a great white gate. They formed a single file line, and this silent Banto-type figure, like a Buddhist guardian, gate guardian, was standing there with a spear, and silently would gesture to the right or to the left, and they have automatic doors apparently, because the doors would open silently, and these people would sort of move towards the light or the dark. And the feeling was that the light door was very attractive and a place you'd be very happy going, and the dark door was very strong, ugly, negative feeling, but you couldn't help going if it was your turn to go. And he's there, maybe fourth or fifth in line, at the bottom of the line, and suddenly he heard everyone calling his name. And as they called his name, he began to open his eyes, and he was surrounded, that's his dad in the middle with the beard, he was surrounded by figures of his family, who were in fact calling his name. It was 49 days later, he was waking up in the hospital. Takuro today plays baseball and does judo. He's in college, he's fine. His head is back to normal. If you hadn't been told he was in a fatal accident, you wouldn't believe it. But his experience is not so uncommon among people who come close to death in Japan as well as in America. And we have a number of instances that document this. Next slide, please. Now, where do we go with Takuro's experience? Near-death experiences are nothing new to you. If you want to read about them in the Japanese or Chinese context, my latest book called Breaking the Circle is about breaking the wheel of rebirth, and it includes chapters on near-death experiences in China and Japan and Tibet. Get all the juicy examples from there because I've taken enough time on that tonight. But there are a couple of interesting implications for you and me here now. Number one is, even when the doctors say, oh no, he's gone, doctors don't always know what they think they know. And good loving care sometimes brings about amazing recoveries. In many near-death experiencers whom I've interviewed, the common factor is not the diagnosis. It's not the age, sex, income, or attitude towards life. It's that some people very close to them, physically and psychologically, were praying very hard, maybe holding their hand and calling their name for them to come back. Now that doesn't guarantee a cure. I'm sure lots of people call names and pray very hard for people who come back who don't. And that, of course, as you and the Buddha know, doesn't guarantee eternal life. It's just a few more minutes or hours, in many cases. But the point I'm making is the psychological ties, or the mental ties, the spiritual ties, choose the word in English you like, between the patient and the nearest ones, can have an impact on that person's medical prognosis, as more and more doctors begin to realize. The second thing that's interesting here is that these experiences seem to be pretty irrespective of race, creed, or color, of age. I mean by age, I mean period, whether it's ancient Japanese history or modern Japanese history, modern Hawaii or modern France. We get very similar sorts of experiences. And we can't really think these are genetically transmitted because the selfish gene only has interest in, as I understand it, transmitting what is beneficial to its ancestors. in their survival or their group survival. And whether the individual later dies a happy death with a happy vision or a painful death with no vision isn't of particular interest to any particular piece of DNA. At least that's the best reading I've heard doctors give me. And the last and maybe most important factor of thinking about death is it makes us ask, what's really important? The old phrase, you can't take it with you, becomes very, very true when you interview dying people or near-death experiencers. And they tell me very widely when I ask, what was most important to you? It wasn't the day I became chairman of the board. It wasn't the day I made my first million. It wasn't the day I became Phi Beta Kappa. It wasn't all those things people think I'm famous for. What was really important in my life, when I look back on it, was helping that bird with the broken wing. I forgot about that. He flew into our yard and couldn't fly. I nursed him to health and he flew away. And I never wanted anything for it. Never saw him again. When I look back at my life, somehow that's adding a little bit of harmony, a little bit of beauty, a little bit of health to the universe. And it's really good I did that. Or it was helping out that struggling student who was lost in Japan. And he couldn't have made it anywhere without a bit of translation and money. And we Japanese are usually fairly conscious of when we give something, we'll get something in return. But in that case, he was just lost and I was just being helpful. And I took him where he needed to go and gave him some money for food and whatever. And never saw him again, but looking back on it, you know, that's something I should have done more of. I'm really glad I did that. On the other hand, every kid has fights with his kid brother or kid sister. But that one time, I beat my kid brother to within an inch of his life. I beat him to a pulp. He thought it was just so teed off. I'd forgotten about that. But that frenzy, that anger, that utter lashing out at things that are basically good, that's really, really wrong. And it hurts me to remember that, and I had to remember that in this experience. Or in another case, a true case, 56-year-old vice president of a Japanese corporation says, I never thought about the stuff we were dumping into the river and into the air when I was vice president of the corporation. It was a standard operating procedure, right? To get rid of your waste. And when I was undergoing this near-death experience, reviewing my life, I realized for the first time in my life how many people I had stepped up or shoved out of the way in order to become vice president. And I saw for the first time what they might have felt like being shoved out of opportunity because of my aggressiveness. And then I saw all the gunk we were putting into the sky and the water. And when I came back from this experience, I revived, I'm now healthy. I told my wife and kids, I told my company first, if we don't stop polluting, I quit. Company said, you're off your rocker. Everybody else we compete with pollutes. We can't afford not to pollute. So he says, I quit. Turns in his resignation. And then he's got his wife and family to deal with. They say, how are you going to pay for the second house and the Mercedes and the kids' education? He says, I'm sorry. That's not as important as living right. And now I know. And it was a very painful lesson, physically and psychologically, but I can't betray that now. That's what I learned. Well, his family broke up. It's a messy story. But fortunately, we don't have to wait. I can think each night as I go to bed, what did I do right today? What did I do wrong? How can I do a little better tomorrow? What did I really value about the conversation or the people or the whatever it was that happened to me? And how can I enhance that and build on that and be a little more connected and thankful? Because from a Japanese viewpoint, There's nothing wrong with giving a little, taking a little, compromising. There's nothing wrong with being dependent. And there's nothing wrong with acknowledging people are my superiors, from whom I have a lot to learn. Hope a little of that may be helpful to you. And I have a lot to learn from you, so instead of my talking anymore, I want to give the rest of the time to your questions, ideas, comments, whatever. Thank you. Want to be the MC here, Arthur, or are there mics to go around?
Any questions for?
Right over there.
You just ran through something. I'm not sure I really heard it correctly or understood it, even if I did hear it. You talk about DNA and you talk about ancestors. Is that correct? And the fact that the DNA does not seem to be waiting for certain kinds of information. Do you remember that part?
Yes.
Can you clarify a little bit?
I'll try.
Okay.
There are arguments that the near-death experience is genetically transmitted. Against those arguments are arguments that the things that are genetically transmitted are generally those things which benefit either the individual or more frequently the subspecies, the group, the family in which that individual is participating. If we take that more traditional Darwinian view that it's to benefit the species and survival of the species or the adaptability of the species or however you want to phrase that, then whether the particular individual after procreating has a happy death or a sad death does not seem to be something that's very genetically relevant to the adaptability or survival of that group to whom the DNA has been transmitted. Because the death experience inevitably follows the procreation experience. Does that make more sense?
Yes.
Sorry I didn't make it clear the first time. So it's not clear and it's not a closed case yet, but the debates tend to be now leaning on the side that it's not merely a DNA transmitted sort of hallucination. Please.
Could you talk some about how they look at the situation when many people die at the same time? For example, in the Kobe earthquake or the fireball during World War II, those two kinds of situations.
I'm not sure what you're asking. I know the situations. I was fairly close to the Kobe earthquake, but what do you want to know?
Well, what would be your idea? Are the people sharing a death experience together? The people who died at the moment, do they share a death experience together?
It's very unclear, but I think the answer is, while we mourners, because there are so many of them, we grieve them together, and we have large monuments to war dead, or Tokyo earthquake dead, or Kobe earthquake dead, or massive disaster dead. The Japanese Buddhist / Shinto reading on that would be, each person takes his or her consciousness, memories, relationships, that whole set of luggage, and death is probably the loneliest experience we go through, in the sense that nobody else really ever dies with us. We can hold their hand until the moment we go on to some other experience. But at that point, we are going on to some other experience, and they're not with us. And while it's theoretically possible that a couple that were very spiritually close and had meditated together and done everything together, that their souls might be soulmates like two trees that grow together out of the same mythology. I think on the whole, each person who is defined in terms of relationships has a unique karma, a unique set of mental and physical actions that they're carrying that will create their future world. Now, I should add to that that there's a distinct sense that in that future world are deceased relatives. So that long gone deceased relatives will be met in the next realm. At least in a temporary a temporary realm before the next rebirth. And in some Buddhist terminology, that's a more permanent realm called Pure Land, from which there is no more physical rebirth. There are two takes on that in different sides of Buddhism. So there is an acquaintance with the previously deceased, but I guess the only other take I can give you on that is, after the earthquake, there was a great rash of what you might call psychic phenomena, people seeing ghosts and dreams of departed people, of people feeling the spirits of the dead in certain places. There are those in the audience who may poo-poo this, and others who are more in tune with mana or the spirit of the land and place and people who can sense power in a place. But after the earthquake, when there was such tremendous tragedy and suffering, many people claim to feel themselves being gripped by the shoulder, for example, as they would approach a certain area, or being called mournfully by voices of people they couldn't see who must have been departed before. There are people who go to the beaches of Normandy and don't know that those are battles of 50 years ago, and smell, see, or hear battle sounds. And the same happens in battlefields in Japan. I don't know how to explain all that. We don't have that worked out in modern science yet. But those kinds of experiences are very real to the Japanese. Does that approach what you're after? Yes, lady back.
How did the family of the eyeless father resolve their problem?
I call a priest. And the priests conduct services for the repose of the soul of the eyeless father. And I didn't do a follow-up on that one, but I suspect that may have been sufficient. I should also add that grief counseling, which I do a little of and other people do more than I in Japan, is extremely effective economically as well as psychologically. If you compare, let me first say, grief counseling is when the doctor or the physician or attending counseling people work not only with the person, the patient, but with the patient's important others, the family. And they start working with the family before the patient has made the transition, and continue working with the family like once a month for several months after the transition. That's, in a nutshell, bereavement grief counseling. Now, if you compare the rates of sudden death, suicide, accident, sudden sickness, and mental derangement among the normal population with those rates for people who don't have grief counseling, like 4 to 5 to 1. People who lose a wife or a husband or a father or a mother or somebody very dear who don't have counseling before and after have a terribly high rate of sudden death, accident, disease, derangement, or suicide. But people who have grief counseling, somebody they care about or cares about them, very often a priest, who will talk to them before and during and after the transition, have no more of these problems than the average population. Now, if I'm Clinton or an insurance maker or anybody looking at a national health policy, it makes a whole lot more sense to invest a few $100 in a grief counselor to stick with that family all through the process than thousands and tens of thousands to remedy the injuries and sicknesses and other things they get into without that kind of counseling. And that kind of argument is being made on both sides of the Pacific. The argument is also being made, I know I'm varying from your question a little bit, but I want to get this in, that Buddhist priests have for centuries been the grief counselors par excellence. This has been their job up until the 19th century. In the 19th century, there was the Meiji Restoration, and down with Buddhism, up with Shinto, so Buddhism got shoved under the rug, and then MacArthur came in and shoved Shinto under the rug, and Buddhism was long forgotten, and now the Buddhist priests mostly do after-death counseling, which isn't enough. But there's a growing movement, I'm happy to say, like Project Donahue in Hawaii, called the Bihar movement in Japan, in which temples and priests are getting into caring for the terminal. And it's perfect because the temples are the one place in the entire country that still have all the things the Japanese wanted. Blue sky, green grass, trees, sound of water, all the rest. And time and ability to counsel. I'm really hoping that's going to expand. There was a question over here first. Okay.
I know that one of the things that you've been interested in doing is finding indigenous Japanese models for dealing with medical ethics, and I think that you used it with two separate examples, extraordinary and insightful. I'm going to get it right, but right on target. However, there's another kind of suicide, self-sacrifice. And it seems to me that that paradigm is used a great deal in the West. If I'm going to die giving my organs to someone else, an actor, and certainly also not on the Japanese context, in kamikaze and so forth, that neither of those two kinds of other cases, but it is a suicide that one is chosen for the benefit of others. I'm wondering how that would fit into the Japanese context, whether you think I'm right that that is a more common model used in the Western context, for understanding what happens to the dead is somehow like self-sacrifice for others, and that's how we look at organ transplants.
Self-sacrifice is not the commonest reason for suicide in the West. However, it is probably the commonest justification for those suicides thought to be justifiable, as is clear in the case of the Catholic Church canonizing people who have suicided only in the case of self-sacrifice and in no other cases. In Japan, yes, self-sacrifice is clearly the case, and I think this is most common in the cases that don't even look like sacrifice. Let's imagine a case where the parent is expecting to undergo serious hospitalization. The family, thinking in terms of interdependence and honoring the elder, will lavish all the funding and time and care they can on that elder person, even if it means putting themselves into serious debt. And the elder person, knowing that, will very frequently do the equivalent of sacrificial suicide, refusing to eat, refusing medication, refusing whatever, so that the funds will remain in the young family to put Johnny through college or whatever. That kind of thing is certainly present. I don't have figures on the ratio at this point.
You missed part of the question. Part of it is that I wasn't talking about what is called suicide. I'm saying what is the suicide with dignity in the culture? What are the ones that are held up as good suicide? Those are the separate examples you used.
Yes, and the example you
So
used.
therefore, self-sacrifice is the type that has, we don't have a separate tradition in the West. That's the kind of sacrifice that we honor, and that also is honored in the Japanese context in certain forms. And so my question is, it seems that that is one of the guy who gave his corneas for his eyes, was obviously giving his corneas not to his in-group. It was to somebody out there who needed eyes. I mean, that sounds like a self-sacrifice kind of model for that. And I'm wondering if you think that that is what is foreground or the background is, whatever in the Japanese Western context is different. Do you think this is relevant to medical ethics, or could be relevant to medical ethics in Japan? The idea of the self-sacrifice model as a justification for giving organs?
A number of Buddhist scholars in Japan have tried to use the self-sacrifice model in order to encourage Buddhists to donate organs. They have been singularly unsuccessful. Their message falls on deaf ears. In short, what I think is essentially Shinto belief, reinforced by certain later Confucian traditions, that the body is essentially sacred and needs to be carried to the grave in its pristine form, that is much more psychologically deep-seated than appeals to altruism. Part of what some Buddhist philosophers are now trying to do, and I think needs doing, is to apply the Japanese Buddhist scriptural tradition to current problems, like environment and medical ethics and so on. The issue Dr. Kasulis raises is extremely important in this context. You can find passages in the sutras which will certainly justify donating organs, or at least in the Jataka tales, not in the sutras. But for those to be psychologically persuasive, will take a great deal of other kinds of work other than reading sutras. They're not at this point. We had a question back. No. Glory in Dying died 50 years ago. No. I agree with you, that was a long myth about the Japanese tradition. And there were people, by myth I don't mean it's totally false or totally true. It's an image the Japanese held about themselves of glorious death. And some suicides from Tamitomo all the way up through Mishima are seen by seen as glorious by some people. But the mood since August of 1945 is that the glorification of death was a very bad thing. It was abused, perverted. It lost us the flower of our generation. And death is not glorious. And when I was younger and foolish enough to speak about the glory of death in the samurai tradition or whatever, in front of a somewhat mature audience, I was soundly rebuked. That doesn't mean it was never a part of the tradition. And it was strongly ingrained from about 1930 to 1945. But it wasn't very strong before that, except in a very small class of elite Kazoku and samurai. And it was never strong in the average farmer. And since the defeat, part of the whole Japanese reluctance to even think about dying or speak about death and dying is that it was also phonily beautified, if there is such English. It was played up to be so glorious, but to the people who were dying, the people who come back from kamikaze missions in shame because their plane fell down halfway through or something, describe their feelings. And we have diaries of people who've been in the kamikaze missions. We have diaries of their mothers. And they're not, in many cases, yelling, Tenno Banzai, hail to the emperor. They're crying, Mami, Mami, Okara-san, as they go down the flames. And their mothers aren't waving a flag proudly saying, I'm proud my son died for the empire. In most cases, they've got to keep that face during the war. But afterwards, there's a lot of bitterness. There's a lot of, what was this all about? Why did we have to go through this? And attempts to glorify that are very unkosher at the moment. I think Americans have far more interest in that than the Japanese do. Yes?
What about the hierarchical society in Japan? Would that be more to serve the individual or to serve the group? Because you mentioned, like, the superior knowing what's best for you. And he has a special interest in you as a subordinate.
So when I follow my superior's advice or request, Am I thinking more about me or about the group? Is he thinking more about me or the group? That's not a question that enters the Japanese context. I don't exist apart from a group. My whole being is because I am affiliated in certain circles in which I work. Of course, I'm a different persona to my wife than I am to my mentor, than I am to my students, and I have different relationships to each of those groups and responsibilities to each of those groups. But what would I do apart from all of their interests? I can't even imagine. Because my life is dedicated to fulfilling that role as a teacher and a student and a husband, and deprived of every conceivable relationship and role, what would I do? I might fast until I die. It's just unimaginable. And for the Japanese, your question would be very hard to phrase, I think.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking in terms of like the organ transplants, I would think that it would be in the interest for a superior to make a decision before a subordinate to say donated organs in the interest of the group.
Yes.
If they don't accept that idea.
Can you hear me back? The superiors in an organization like the Japan Medical Association might very well decide that we're in the interest of a larger group, like the collective body of patients, to have an individual's organs donated. This is a great fear. In the case of significant others making that decision, the person's genuine hopes and feelings and relationships can be considered. If the chief osteopathic surgeon or whoever it is comes in and is faced with that decision from a very shallow information base about what this person is and cares about and is related to, we can have some very abused decisions. Ken?
Just on the same thing, the Mickey Mantle case just a few weeks ago highlighted the question of who donates and who receives goods.
Yes.
You mentioned that there's a lot of negative feeling towards physicians who take organs from brain dead bodies.
Yeah.
Is the negativity equally strong against those who are beneficiaries of transplants? Are there Japanese who go abroad, for example, to a transplant patient that could not be done in Japan? And is there a negative attitude towards those who benefited from that?
Yes and yes. A few, not very many, but a publicized few do go abroad to get transplantations abroad. And those who get transplantations, either abroad or from other Japanese, are faced with great ambivalence on their return to society. On the one hand, everybody is happy to have them back and functioning. And on the other hand, there's a sense in which they're not really them, or they're living on borrowed time, or I don't completely believe this myself, so I may have trouble communicating it, but if the person is more tightly identified with body than some Westerners would identify people with body alone, then for significant parts of the body to be exchanged casts some hazy questions about the nature of their identity. I've heard it phrased a little differently in this way. If the young lady gets a new liver, which is enabling her to live on now for more years, and then she has a baby, the baby will not be receiving fluids processed by its mother's liver, but by an old man's liver. And the liver of the mother that now has this extra stress on it, instead of being 30 years old, is 55 years old and is a man's liver. And what's that going to do to the baby? Now, as a Westerner, that wouldn't bother me in the slightest. As somebody trying to sympathize with the Japanese worldview, this is the kind of complaint that becomes raised. The further issue that's raised at the Paris conference, and will come up in Beijing again this fall, is many Western countries are desperate for organ donors because not enough young people ride motorcycles without helmets. And that's where we get all our organs from. And So you're getting countries in Western Europe proposing age limits, proposing possibly kind of minimum IQ limits, like nobody who's mentally deficient gets organs, proposing possible contribution to society scales. This gets real hairy. Who's to say what really will be a contribution to society? But the point is, if thousands of people all want new livers, and you don't have kids dying on motorcycles to give them new livers, where are you going to draw the line? And you can either leave it up to the black market or the capitalist market. The goods go to the highest bidder, which is often the case in medical treatment. Or if you try to be, in some sense, fairer about distribution, you run into all sorts of hairy questions. And while the Japanese admit that it would be nice to have more people with new livers or transplanted livers and transplanted hearts, looking both at the quality of life of many of those people with transplanted organs and the whole can of worms that this opens, there's a lot of hesitation to get into it. A third prospect on the horizon that may change all this is Japan will probably have good artificial hearts in the next 5 to 10 years. It's just a matter of miniaturization, which is their specialty in so many fields. We've got good artificial hearts now, except they're so bulky and outside of the heart that you can't walk around with them very easily, and they're not sensitive enough to bodily needs. If you start breathing faster, you have to turn up the dial on the heart. It doesn't automatically pump faster when you need more blood. But within 5 to 10 years, the companies give me different estimates, we're likely to have Japanese-made and probably British, Dutch-made, Phillips is working on it, hearts that are small enough to fit into the body and tuned enough to the body that they can pump as much as you need. Well, in that case, this whole issue of transplanting live hearts from one beating heart person to another beating heart person, we're going to look back on this 1968 to 1999, or whenever it stops, period, and say, gee, wasn't that a barbaric age? And maybe it saved a lot of people. And maybe it killed some people who could have come back that we don't know about. And I'm not going to take a stand on that. I'm just trying to give you the Japanese slice on it. More and more hands. I think the man in the back is first.
Do you have any comments regarding reports that indicate that the majority of Japanese people support the death penalty?
My wife is well studied on that. I don't have good information on that. We have the death penalty in rare cases. It gets used once every few years on very serious cases that are apparently unreformable. I don't know what the Japanese statistic on that is.
I guess I'm thinking in context of your speech, your talk tonight, and concepts of living and dying.
There are both very strong traditions of vengeance, which would dictate death penalty, and strong traditions more in the Buddhist line of forgiveness. And I don't know that any particular religious cut or medical cut could be correlated to a poll on how Japanese feel about that. I think the main factors that I see in the press are economic. That it costs a tremendous amount of money to keep somebody healthy in prison for 50 years. And if they had proven by murdering someone every time they get out of prison for 4 or 5 times and they get rehabilitated, they still go out and do it again and again, that this is an awful big tax burden. And that isn't maybe a good moral argument on why you should or shouldn't keep someone alive. I know money and morality are on the same level, but I'm afraid that's where most of the discussion occurs. Yes? Vic?
This is a little more personal. I'm just wondering what it's like for you to be a Westerner and also to be a Japanese.
You know, sometimes I walk by a store window and I think, geez, that's a funny face. Where did that come from? And then it's me. I'm not aware that I'm Western most of my life because everyone I deal with is Japanese. And I live totally in Japanese language for 98% of my waking life. My wife tells me I'm bilingual. bilingual in my sleep talk. If I can behave in such a way that the Japanese never feel awkward, or that they have to behave any differently with me than they would behave with anybody else, then everything's cool. If they praise my Japanese, it's usually a sign I've made a slip somewhere. Because as long as everything is going along fine, they never even have to think, oh yeah, Becker's Caucasian. We just do our business and go about our work together and everything rolls well. And if I make a faux pas at one point or another, somebody realizes, my God, he's been doing this all, even though he's raised in another culture, that's pretty amazing. We'll have to give him credit for as far as he goes. Oh, Joe's his name. I usually do marvelously on the phone, and when people don't get caught up in appearance. And it usually takes me a matter of days or weeks of dealing with somebody before they get over dealing with appearance. At first, I look so different that it takes them a little bit of getting used to. And once they realize that I'm functioning in very similar ways, or as almost identical ways to how they function, then it's no longer an issue. I guess it's like getting used to a black roommate, or an Oriental roommate for me 30 years ago. At first it was, maybe he's different, maybe he's not, how am I supposed to feel and all this. But as we get closer and work together on things, it's not even an issue anymore. So I'm sure that the average Japanese on the street will always see me as a strange foreigner. And I can't be bothered, because the average person in Hawaii may think I'm a funny-looking Howley. And the average person in New York may think I'm a, funny-looking something or other. And it's not an issue for me.
Do you shift your modalities when you go off the plane in Honolulu or Paris?
Oh, yeah.
Quickly?
It's a matter of hours. Some parts shift faster than others. Switching languages is the big modality shifter. If immediately I have to shift into Japanese to answer some Japanese question, a whole lot of things about my posture and my movement and other things are going to shift with that, I'm sure. Yeah.
I'm just wondering how accepting Japanese medical professionals and permanent locations in their families are of the hospice movement that's just getting started in Japan, as opposed to taking care of the terminally ill at home. There might be a social stigma there, a feeling of shame. And also, is there a stigma associated with the Buddhist priests and monasteries because of their traditional association with death?
Very perceptive set of questions. Home care, stigma, and Buddhist priests. For starters, let me give you a survey that came out last year, I think, but data was from '93. It asked 1,000 British, Germans, and Japanese about whether they would care for their elders up until their elders' passing, how they would deal with terminal care in the family. Roughly, 50% of the British said they wanted to care for their elders until they passed, preferably in a home setting. In fact, about 40% do. 60-some% of the Germans, this included East Germany, was on Berlin, said they wanted to care for their German parents until passing. And in fact, something around 50%, 48% do. 72% of Japanese said, we want to care for our parents until they're passing. 22% do. It's not because they don't want to, but economic factors make it impossible. Land values are so unbelievable that you couldn't add a room to your house if you wanted to. And when both parents frequently work, and teenage children are all at juku, at cram schools, there's no one left at home to care for an aged parent, particularly if there were stairs involved, and most multi-level dwellings use stairs instead of elevators. If the elderly parents live out in the countryside, The younger generation can rarely commute to the countryside to care for them. So the hospice movement is very needed, not because Japanese don't want to care for their elders, but because economically, logistically, it's not very easy to do so. There are about 20 hospices, maybe 18 functioning now in Japan. All but 2 of them are Christian. This is a problem. Not because I have anything against Christianity, but the give and take we talked about earlier becomes a heavy pressure on the person who's cared for and the family. Very few Japanese are Christian, less than 1%. But if they go to a Christian hospice, now they're getting a lot of care from Christians. And of course they pay for the services and the fees and everything else, but the care involves an exchange of more than just money. There's time, there is love, there is relationship, there is sewa involved there. And the only way you can return that is by doing something that will be emotionally meaningful to the other party. And what can you do if you're on your deathbed? Which is very clearly the not-so-hidden agenda of the hospices. They want to make converts even on their deathbeds, whether for monetary or other reasons. So that poses a lot of problems, both for Japanese and for me watching that situation. There are a couple of Buddhist hospices. Unfortunately, they're wings of hospitals. And the Japanese medical profession doesn't yet have clear in its head that there are curable diseases and uncurable death. And you ought to work to cure diseases through medicine and alternative medicine and any other means you can find. But as the Buddha pointed out, and we heard from Ann last night, you don't cure death. And it's silly to try after a certain point in someone's degenerative condition. You can keep them comfortable, keep them functioning, keep them living as meaningfully and as richly and fully a life as possible. What this usually means is, and this could be true in Honolulu for all I know, I haven't studied here, many people are given a choice. Would you rather have a month at home, living very much the lifestyle you have now, with occasional painkillers, shots to take care of the pain, and we'll look in on you once in a while? Or we can keep you alive for a year with chemo and radiation, and by the way, you'll be mostly bedridden and you lose all your hair and you have to be body fed and fluid fed. What would you choose? Most Japanese would much prefer the former. A month of close to normal lifestyle in a close to normal setting than a year of extended operations. Many doctors don't give that option to their patients, and the patients are becoming increasingly vocal that they want this. We are beginning to develop home care services like Project Dhamma that will volunteer service to elders who need it. The government is beginning to fund this kind of nursing capacity. And there are a few temples that are beginning to contribute to it. But the point is, a hospice doesn't need medicine, except maybe a little painkiller. A hospice doesn't have to be bacteria-free, because you're not trying to cure bacterial diseases anymore. A hospice doesn't have to have people with masks and hospital robes and sterilized walls and smelling of whatever hospitals smell of. Because a hospice is a place for living your end, not dragging out your end. And it could be at home if you have home support will do that, or it could be a temple if the temple will agree to do that, or it could be new hospices that we're trying to develop without Christian support with the Japanese government. And there you can have your pets until your last moment if you want them, or your flowers, or your drooling grandkids, or whatever keeps you happy, because that's what's important. I think our time is way over, and I'm grateful for your questions. I'll be happy to talk further afterwards. Thank you all for coming and bearing with me in this cold auditorium. I hope this has given you a little bit of insight about Japan, and maybe even a little for your own activities. That's it, thanks.
In Japan, where there were many temples, many priests, and the recent events in the last 4 years have made more of a social impact there than in the United States. One thing I want to point out too is that the Soka Gakkai has conducted throughout its history a very rigorous study program, and this has been open to every member. So rather than just a few people becoming well versed in the concepts of Buddhism, the principles of the teaching, and the original writings of Nichiren or other sutras that he refers to, this is something that is very broadly spread throughout the membership. So when you talk to the average member of the SGI, they are very familiar with these terms. And so this is something that I can't say for sure, but I feel it probably is a historical precedent that there be such a widespread, more tens of millions of ordinary citizens, ordinary people who are very familiar with sutras, very familiar with these concepts and principles of Buddhism and using them in their daily life. It's obvious from this lecture series that Buddhists are not afraid to talk about the subject of death. You know, this is actually, I think, an unusual thing for this many people to be together so many days talking about death and dying without it turning morbid. But this is unfortunately not true at all in society as a whole. Death and dying is a subject that's truly avoided at all costs. It makes people uncomfortable. They don't know how to deal with it. And it was expressed this way in a speech that SGI President Daisaku Ikeda gave at Harvard University in 1993. The speech was titled Mahayana Buddhism in the 21st Century Civilization. He said, modern civilization has attempted to forget and ignore death, especially Western tradition he's talking about. We have diverted our gaze from this most fundamental of problems. Death has been driven into the shadows. It's considered something to be abominated only. For modern humanity, death is the mere absence of life, blankness and void. Life is identified with all that is good, with being, the rational, with light. Death is only evil, nothingness, the dark and irrational. In all regards, it's only the negative perception of death exists. So this is our current situation, I think, in the United States. But there's really nothing more important than understanding death. Nichiren admonishes us to, quote, first study death, then study other matters. Why is this so important? Well, because, as has been said before, it's the starting point for life. When one understands death, one begins to know the purpose of life and how to live it. So I'd like to give some basic views of life and death from the teachings of Nichiren as SGI members understand them and practice them. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the more life-affirming ideas in Buddhism. When I say Buddhism or SGI, I'm going to be talking about this particular sect of Buddhism because, again, I feel many people may not be familiar with it. I think there's many, many things that are in common and parallel with all the other ideas of Buddhism we've been hearing about, but some things are specific and a little bit different. And then I'd like to talk about the actually facing the suffering of death within our tradition and try and show maybe some practical examples of how we deal with that. Life is eternal in Buddhism, as it's been said, but again, this is a new concept. We can just say it, and a person could just say, okay, I accept that or believe that, but getting that to become something that you truly understand or know within your heart intuitively is something that requires practice, requires something of your own experience. So theoretically, though, we've lived lifetime after lifetime, no beginning, no end, but this life has two distinct phases. The active phase is what we usually call life, and the inactive phase is what we would refer to as death. So life and death are two aspects of the same things. And these cycles repeat endlessly. We'd also describe it sometimes as the cycle of birth, maturity, old age, or decline, and then death. In Japanese, joju e ku. And all things go through this cycle: birth, maturity, decline, and death. Another way to describe this is birth, living, decline being just death itself, and then an intermediary phase of life, which would be between death and rebirth. So sometimes it's easier to talk about it that way. The cycles of life and death, though, can be compared to the alternating periods of sleeping and being awake. In the morning, we're fresh, hopefully, if you haven't had a bad night. Wake up full of energy, youthful in your outlook, do many things during the day. Towards the evening, you're beginning to become tired. You feel, sleepy, and you look forward to death. Excuse me, you look forward to sleep. Because it's such a natural thing that you have no fear of sleep because there will be a tomorrow. You wake up and you begin again. The period of sleep is refreshing for you. And within our view of life and death, death serves the same purpose. It's a period of time when you're able to regenerate and recover, draw new energy from the universe and be reborn again. The vitality of a baby and a youth is, far greater than as an older person can see. This energy comes from that period. But there's also, of course, the concept of karma, and that everything is based on cause and effect. So, a very simple way of describing this: the causes you make, good or bad, during your lifetime are, some of them are quickly played out. We would say light karma quickly shows up as an effect. Heavier karma shows up much later, maybe in life, and the heaviest of karma doesn't show up until a next lifetime or a future lifetime. So when we view the inequality of people at birth, the concept of karma makes a great deal of sense in that why is life so different or so seemingly unfair from different people? Some baby may be born in very fortunate circumstances, in a loving family, in a peaceful land, and have many opportunities, be healthy. Another baby may be born with serious health problems, or be born into a land that is torn with conflict and just hell, or a family that has such a tremendous suffering and hellish experience. So the difference being that when the life left this earth, they had such a predisposition or such a karma, and that when they're reborn, their life condition was more or less seeking out the conditions that matched their inner condition in the surroundings in which they were born. So in that sense, by how we live, by the choices we make and the actions we take through our thoughts, words, and deeds, we're choosing our parents, our circumstances for the next lifetime. I'm having to make this very simple. All this is greatly simplified, and it may seem trivial in a sense, but there's great depth behind this, and one of the hallmarks of Nichiren's Buddhism is to make it accessible to ordinary people, and not to make it abstract or very obscure. So the Soka Gakkai also makes things very down to earth and practical, but as we study them, we can find the terminology, the doctrine, the theoretical proof behind all of these points of view. So overcoming suffering or living a life of value creation is the point of Buddhism. And maybe the best way to explain the goal of attaining enlightenment or absolute happiness in this lifetime can be explained by the concept of the 10 worlds. 10 worlds come from Nichiren Daishonin's explanation of Ichinen Sanzen, a theory propounded by Tendai in China, drawn from the Lotus Sutra. And the 10 worlds are not places, as sometimes is explained, where you are born into in another lifetime. For instance, living a certain way in this lifetime, being reborn into the world of hunger or hungry spirits. And that's like a place or another existence where a person would be trapped, or into the world of animality, where they would actually be born as an animal and live in that world. But rather, we view these 10 worlds as life states or conditions of life that a human being experiences all the time. They are hell, suffering physically or mentally, hunger, animality, anger, tranquility, rapture, learning, realization, bodhisattva, and Buddha. These 10 worlds are all something that we can experience. In the lower 9, we experience quite frequently. The lower 6 don't require any effort. So as you go through your day, according to your environment, always a stimulus from your environment, a person, a changing circumstance, you will find your life in one of these life states. And sometimes you'll change rapidly. If you wake up in the morning and you hear a large crash outside and run outside and find out that your car has been smashed into, you may become upset. But then maybe you come back into the house and there's a delicious smell of someone preparing breakfast for you, and you feel wonderful, at peace, or in rapture. It would be a better example if I reverse those two. How quickly you can change from being happy to being angry to being curious about something to many different states we change. Rapture is the state of having a desire fulfilled or accomplished, but all these are very temporary. They're not anything you can hold on to as permanent happiness. Rapture being the highest of these, then making effort in terms of learning about life through your own effort, study, gaining things from the teachings of other people, realization, being self-reflection, learning about life from your own things. These are things that you find in students and people and contemplative people all the time. Their life condition is higher, happier than being in hell or hunger or something like that, but we still experience all of these. And then bodhisattva, an altruistic life condition or state of caring about serving and helping other people, is also something that you find naturally in people. In Nichiren Daishonin's teachings, Buddhahood, though, is a state that there isn't an external cause for without the practice of Buddhism. And this is why Buddha came into the world, and down through the centuries, the teachings of Shakyamuni, in particular the Lotus Sutra, then through in China and Tiantai's interpretations of it, and finally in Nichiren Daishonin's explanations of it, it made this essential teaching available to people by which they could activate their state of Buddhahood. And that this state of Buddhahood exists within you as certainly as hell does, certainly as rapture does, and all the other states of life as part of you. But the practice of Buddhism enables you to bring this out. And this is something that you don't have to believe in, you don't even have to understand. But Nichiren taught that it was such a direct cause of enlightenment that he was teaching the chanting of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, the title of the Lotus Sutra, and having faith in the fact that your life itself was no different than the life of the Buddha, that your life itself was no different than the life of the universe. And with this faith and this chant of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, you were able to activate this Buddha nature within you. So the idea is that as you're actually chanting, and members who are practicing this Buddhism do this every day in their home in the morning and the evening, as you're doing this, at that moment that you're chanting this, you are fully having activated the state of Buddhahood, which in many teachings is something that is a very distant goal, but rather this is fundamentally activating the state of Buddhism within your own life instantly at that point. When you stop chanting, though, you remain in the lower 9 worlds, and so you carry out your activities in life in these lower 9 states, hopefully moving higher towards the state of bodhisattva. And most people have an underlying fundamental tendency in their life. And this might be a state of rapture, if it was a person who tended to be happy. It could be a state of anger for some people. There could be many different fundamental things, animality for a person who tends to be really jealous and watching, from other people. And in a busy circumstance of environmental stimulation, we're affected and able to distract ourselves. But it's like when all things are gone and we're totally quiet and alone, what do we sort of settle back down into? Some people might be in the world of learning. Leave them alone, they won't go to a party, they'll go to a library and read a book. They have that as their fundamental tendency. So as we practice, the goal is to make Buddhahood the fundamental tendency within our own life. This is underlying all the things that are practiced within our Buddhism. And why I'm explaining this is that the process for dying or preparing for death or looking forward to your next lifetime is something that is exactly the same as how you're living every day. In other words, there's no special preparation for death, but rather every day you're activating this Buddha nature. Every day you're striving to elevate your actions in your daily life higher in the 9 worlds. Nichiren Daishonin talked about these 10 worlds, saying that if we, we hear about heaven and hell, but if we pause and think about it for a minute, we realize that heaven and hell don't exist somewhere else. They exist within our own life, within our own body. He also said that there are not 2 worlds, no 2 lands, the pure land and the impure land, but rather it depends solely on the minds of the people. If the minds of the people are pure, so is their land. If the minds of the people are impure, so is their lands. There's not 2 different worlds. And so as people purify their life condition, as they polish the diamond, you might say the rough-cut diamond that they truly don't know about, that it exists within their own life, more and more they establish a diamond-like life condition that is not disturbed, is not overturned by the inevitable changes and problems and sufferings that we have to deal with in our life. As people do this, they have an influence on their environment and each other because there's no separation. Esho Funi is a principle of the oneness of a person in their environment. So there's a tremendous impact and change on environmental circumstances, social interactions, relationships among people in a family, or even the environmental issues of a community or of a country, dependent on the inner life condition of the person or the people of that land. We call that process also human revolution. The human revolution is an inner spiritual change, a revolution of character, you might say, that is the making of this Buddhahood as our fundamental nature. And this is, of course, paired with study and efforts to live an altruistic life, the life of the Bodhisattva. The Soka Gakkai organization gives many opportunities for people to encourage, help, serve, and offer service to other people in the form of a bodhisattva. So it's able to give people a balanced practice. We call it Jigyo and Keita, practice for oneself and practice for others. So I've prattled on here, saying a lot about this, but I think this is an essential point I need to make and we need to understand about these 10 worlds and about this establishment of this fundamental life tendency of Buddhahood, because the degree to which we have accumulated good fortune and good karma through our actions in our life are going to be critical at the time of death. I'm going to try and keep this simple. This is a big subject to talk about very briefly. But people, I think, are curious about what happens when you die and the real mechanics of it all. And since we do have something to say about that, that's kind of more interesting, I guess, than some of the more philosophical points. But in the process of dying, I mentioned those birth, living, death, meaning dying process, and the intermediate state between death and rebirth. In the process of death or dying, the palm tree keeps coming up. I'll never forget the exploding palm tree, the firecracker palm tree that was mentioned earlier today. But life doesn't stop in an instant. It's like an oasis in a desert. Maybe is supplied by an underground spring or water. And so it's got a pond, it's got bushes around it, it's got a palm tree or two. And when the water begins to disappear or dries up, the oasis doesn't go, just vanish with it. The water maybe just turns to mud, and then maybe that's dry, but everything is still there. Gradually you see the certain weaker plants disappear. Maybe the grass goes quickly, the bushes slowly disappear, slowly the palm. It takes a process by which things go from an active state into the latent state. And our life is the same. As this process is going on, the condition of belief in the fact that our life is the one with what we refer to as the mystic law, the law of, I should explain. Mystic law, or myoho, is another name we might use for the Buddha or Buddhahood. The Buddhahood that you have in yourself, we would say, at the core of your life, at the ninth level of consciousness, you have this Buddha nature. But in another way, what we're actually saying is that's your life, that Buddha is life. This was one revelation or clarification that Josei Toda, the second president of the Soka Gakkai, had during a time when he was under great stress as a votary of the Lotus Sutra, being persecuted. He was imprisoned by the Japanese government for not accepting the Shinto faith during the war. And he was in prison, starving, and recited the Lotus Sutra, read it over and over, chanted Daimoku, and read the Lotus Sutra endlessly, trying to grasp its meaning of the part where it talks about the different negations, what the Buddha isn't. And he was contemplating this over and over, and it had a mystical revelation, but his conclusion was that the Buddha is life. And to me, when I studied that, or I first heard that, I said, well, that's sure, of course, but apparently that's not been that clear or that simple. And so it makes it much more simple to grasp that you have, the you kind of life, but if you want to go through 9 levels of consciousness, at the deepest level, there's this pure life force, you might say. And that is exactly the same in every person. And it's the same as the life of all things, or the life of the universe. So the life of the universe, this fundamental entity, we could say all phenomena are manifestations of the mystic law. We're all talking about life itself, or that push, a mystic drive or desire, whatever it is. And it's a compassionate desire, fortunately. So in this phase of dying, as this, your life is ebbing, how much you have been able to understand through your intuition and grasp and make a part of yourself that this fundamental entity that is at the core of your life is the same as the life of the universe itself, is very fundamental, because you begin to lose your ability to think, your senses of remembering, your willpower to say, I'm a good Buddhist, I really want to believe this, I'm ready to go. This works for a certain point, but at some point those cognitive abilities are gone, and you're dealing more with a feeling and intuition. And if you become very disturbed during this point, or begin to get scared or nervous, or have a grasping for to live longer, or these things, this could be a very disturbing influence. It reminded me of many of the other things that were described earlier today, and similar, trying to have a clear, calm awareness as you go through this process. Let me read you something here that Daisaku Ikeda wrote in Unlocking the Secrets of Life and Death. In the general turmoil of this process, it's natural that our experience should be very different from that of normal life. If we become frightened and confused because of all the unaccustomed sensations, allowing earthly desires and illusions to permeate our lives in a frantic struggle finally at the moment of death, all the efforts we may have made to elevate ourselves, if not based on the mystic law, may be nullified in a single instant. The way in which we face the moment of death determines whether or not we crown our lives with complete fulfillment. So, from the Buddhist perspective, our ability successfully to pass through the dying process depends on our steady efforts during life to accumulate good causes and to strengthen the foundation of goodness in the depths of our lives. And Nichiren Daishonin wrote about this: be resolved to summon forth the great power of your faith and chant Nam-myoho Renge-kyo with the prayer that your faith will be steadfast and correct at the moment of your death. So even if we have still, maybe through our causes during our lifetime, our balance sheet of good karma, good causes doesn't outweigh our negative causes, then naturally, as is reported in a lot of near-death experiences and things like this, we are confronted with the reality of how we live our life, and we're seeing it in a very clear mirror. As we see these good and bad come back, we seem to be able to, really reflect on them in a very accurate way and feel regret for the things that we've done that have hurt other people, and feel joy for the things that we've done that have really, contributed to the happiness or to the, good of other people. So naturally, we want to have a balance sheet that's pretty strong in the good side. But what Nichiren Daishonin is teaching us also, that far more important even than that balance sheet is the extent to which we maintain unshakable faith in the mystic law. That this is really something that is going to carry us through. Okay. Some practical examples of how we deal with situations with death and dying. Every day in our prayers, we do a silent prayer, 5 in the morning, 3 at night, along with reciting a chapter and a half of the Lotus Sutra. One of those prayers is a memorial for the deceased, and in it we are offering, sending our daimoku, which means Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, to the lives of those who have passed away, who are close to us or we have some contact with. And through this prayer, we're able to influence their lives. If a person is chanting during their lifetime, they certainly can influence their own life condition and have that fundamental tendency to see them through. As they're dying, family often gather around, friends gather around, will chant Nam-myoho Renge-kyo with that person quietly or in another room. And when the person is unable to chant themselves, this daimoku is able to also keep them on that track and have a wonderful effect for them. When the person has died and we weren't there, or even we're feeling concern or suffering the loss and concerned about this person, our prayers are able to touch them also. And Nichiren Daishonin explains this is because these prayers are coming from the state of Buddhahood in ourself as we chant this daimoku, and the person is able to feel this in the level of consciousness that still remains with their life. That the alaya consciousness is the level at which our karma is stored during our lifetime. And as a person passes away, one way of thinking of it is that the karma, the good and bad, and the various other aspects of that person's life are sort of stored as tiny seeds in this alaya consciousness. The person's life fuses back into the life of the universe, hopefully into the life of the universe has 10 worlds as well, hopefully into the world of Buddhahood in the universe, but it could be into any of the other lesser worlds as well. When we continue to chant for this person's happiness, we're able to help them elevate their life condition into the state of Buddhahood. I know this is a very quick form of attaining enlightenment, if you're familiar with general Buddhist theory. Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism is sometimes referred to in his writings as instantaneous enlightenment, because in the cosmic scale of time, to be able to attain Buddhahood in one lifetime is incredible. That's ridiculously quick, and it's almost instantaneous. But that is exactly what his teaching holds, and the reason being that the practice of chanting Nam Myoho Renge Kyo is such a direct, powerful, direct path to enlightenment. So our memorial services, when we have them, are actually just larger groups of people offering the same prayer, chanting the same sutra, the same daimoku, and the same prayer for the peaceful repose and enlightenment of the deceased. We may gather together in a large group and call it a funeral or a memorial service, but we actually are doing a memorial service or for everyone that we wish to pray for twice a day. A unique, I think, aspect of these services within the SGI is that they're invariably joyful events. The funerals that I've been to, both in Christian faiths and in Buddhist religions for friends or colleagues, have been very somber events. And I remember one of the leaders who taught me a lot about Buddhism when I first joined died of cancer years ago, and many of those early people who had gone and lived in other areas, we hadn't seen each other in a long time, there were like 250 people gathered for this memorial service at one of our community centers. And the prayer, the chanting of Daimoku was so strong and vigorous. His wife was there, his children were there, and they asked anybody that wanted to come up and say a few words. People got up and just couldn't say enough about how this man had touched their lives, what had really been the way that he had given them something, and it was laughter and joy, and the whole consciousness of people is, if we are in a joyful state, in other words, we're showing the actual proof of our own life condition from chanting. His wife too was able to, through her prayer, go from a feeling of sadness to a feeling of it's okay, and having a very real sense of not being separated from him in a true sense, but having that closeness that they had still. She could feel that. And as she continued to chant, she began to feel, again, appreciation and joy and hope. We're able to continuously regenerate hope from despair through the personal practice. And when you get 200 people together who've done that, there's a great deal of appreciation and joy and happiness, and feel this is felt by the person. If we look at the near-death experiences, there seems to be lots of awareness, whether a person's just died or even after that, that they're feeling the sorrow of people in the room, or they're feeling the joy. And when they can feel great happiness and joy, this is something that we can share with them. When we feel sadness and despair and loss, this is what we're sending to them. And this is what they're feeling that they left behind. They may feel, a parent may feel terrible having left a family behind after they died, and if all they are getting is tears and sorrow from the feelings of the family, this doesn't help their life condition at all. So we have a very optimistic attitude towards our own faith and practice, and feel that this is really guaranteeing the enlightenment of the deceased. Am I out of time? I think I am. I had some experiences also of SGI members who are in the health professions and who are helping families who are not Buddhist, but rather are, through their own view of life, able to encourage these people, many of whom, regardless of their background, most of them being Christian, don't seem to have any particular guidelines on how to cope with death in the family. One was a nurse named Teresa Hauber back in New Jersey, and she went to this one home. She said, I've got her story here, found this Mrs. L who had died, wanted to die at home, and was there in bed in a coma, not responding to word or touch. Her color was ashen, her extremities blue and cold, her breathing had become labored. When she arrived, the room was dimly lit. In it stood her husband, son, and 2 daughters. All were weepy. I thought how fortunate this 86-year-old woman is. She's in a familiar environment, physically comfortable, surrounded by an obviously caring family. I thought what great effort she must have made to establish value in creating these meaningful relationships. How much effort she must have exerted to instruct her now adult children on the significance of family and harmonious bonds, and how hard it must be for her now to hear them weep without any recourse. Hearing is one of the last senses to go, and if a person is in that state, they're very sensitive to what's going on around them, the crying or the sadness, versus, confidence. In our case, it would be the, chanting of Daimoku would be so reassuring to that person, yet sometimes we don't realize they're able to hear that. The family approached me asking, what can we do? What can we do? Calmly I said, why are the lights out? Why are you crying? Doesn't death come to us all? How fortunate your mother is to be here with all of you. I told the family that hearing is our last sense to leave, and even though their mother couldn't respond, I was confident she was aware of her surroundings. I asked them, please, to the best of their ability, make this a positive experience. I suggested that they hold warm conversations with one another, remembering all the good times they had together, and how wonderful life had been, and how much they appreciated her. I promised to make the patient comfortable, and then I left. About 1 a.m., my beeper sounded, and Mrs. L had passed away. The family requested that I come back out to their home. I arrived at the home, and much to my surprise, all eyes were dry, the lights were on, everyone was smiling, and I was greeted with a big hug. I entered the patient's room, and sure enough, no breathing could be heard nor a pulse felt. Yet Mrs. L appeared so comfortable. Her cheeks were pink, and she had a smile on her face. I also found that her limbs were supple enough, even though it had taken me over an hour and a half to get there after her death. An obvious physical transformation had taken place from when I had been there some hours before. To me, it verified that this person's life was at peace. I congratulated the family and said how wonderful their mother must have been. A few days later, I received a call from Mrs. L's late husband to thank me. He told me that what I had done was beyond medicine and that I will never forget it as long as I live, he said. So I think we can see that Buddha's view of death is something that can help people regardless of whether they practice or not. And in many cases, we have families where one member is practicing this Buddhism, but the rest of the family is not. And someone in the family is dying or has died. The one SGI member goes there with a sense of confidence, with a sense of they're not freaked out. They have an inner strength. And they've gotten that through the many times they've gotten evidence that their chanting works, solving smaller problems in their daily life over and over and over. So death is just another big problem. But with this view,